Hello again, Hopewell Valley Regional School District Campus Security Officers. Welcome back to Implicit Bias Training by On the Mount. I'm your diversity advocate and your facilitator, Marlon Webb. This is the second part of a three-part module that encompasses our discussion on cultural competence. During this module, I'll begin to present the basic mechanics of cultural competence. This presentation will lead us to our online collaboration later this week, at which time we'll plan to engage in discussion topics and scenarios that foster our growth in cultural competence and also reflect our understanding of the importance of cultural competence in the way that we serve. Before we get to our objectives for this module, I'd like to reflect on another topic, actually a nugget of insight regarding bias. So maybe at this point, since we've all spent some time with implicit bias, you understand that we all have bias. So we know we have bias, well, now what? Well, in light of cultural competence, does that mean that you now need to be able to self-disclose any of your bias? Is it required for you to express all your bias to maybe your family, your colleagues, or maybe even the students? I'd say maybe not. Actually, probably not. In my experience, the term transparency has been used a lot over the past 10 years. People are using that word like, hey, I need to be transparent, or can we be 100% transparent when we're talking about whatever subject? I submit to you that renting a billboard and listing your bias is not the best method to be transparent. I imagine that a billboard with my name on it and my bias, it wouldn't be too pretty. So that's okay for now. We're in the process of changing our bias, and regarding that idea of transparency, you don't have to point it out for it to be there. You see, my cultural experience has taught me that a change on the inside shows through on the outside. So let's show that we're a work in progress. With that said, let's get into cultural competence. And so we're on our way. Let's talk a bit about the objectives for this module. The first objective is that we'd like to initiate or enhance individual foundations of cultural competence. The second is to identify the components, working parts of cultural competence. The third is understand who it is that you as CSOs serve. And the fourth is to continue the discussion about microexpressions. So let's get into defining cultural competence. One of the definitions used by the National Center for Cultural Competence at Georgetown University is that it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable that system, agency, or those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. This early definition still holds true today as we seek to establish cultural competence in all the areas of interaction, but most specifically for our work together as professionals that serve the educational community. Let's switch over to what the National Education Association says about it today. So they define it as having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference and the ability to learn and build on the varying culture and community norms of students and their families. Over the past 30 years, there's been much work done to define, redefine, and put into place what we now identify as cultural competence due to the expansion of this principle into so many of the ways that we connect with each other. For the purpose of your role as a CSO and your interaction with students, we'll use the following points to understand the mechanics of cultural competence and hopefully answer the question, how does it apply to you? The key points that we're going to discuss are, the first being understanding of worldview. This is your personal perception of how you react to people who are different from you or the people you've chosen to engage with. A CSO who recognizes, for example, that he has a discomfort with, let's say, Asian students because of experiences serving in the military and being stationed in an Asian country and has some bias that's developed from that. That's an example of a person's worldview. Then we have knowledge of culture. So knowledge of culture outside your culture, sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. In many situations, we assume that we have a good understanding of culturally infused situations based on our past experiences, but we actually may not have adequately engaged with the culture to understand the underlying nuance that is associated with behaviors in that culture. The next is engagement. Engagement with cultures. A step past our knowledge of other cultures, as in our book knowledge, have you connected with people of the target culture? Remember, knowing a single person from a specific culture by no means makes you an expert on that culture. And then we take a look at vantage point, my favorite. Where are you standing? Keep in mind, one of the interesting points about vantage is that it can change. Before you were a CSO, you had a different profession. And as a CSO, you could be called upon to work in a different school and serve a different part of the student population. Where we stand, figuratively and literally, has an impact on culture, competence, and it can easily change based on circumstance. The next is behavior. Behavior translates into skills. Our time together regarding implicit bias has given us a framework to understand the basics of how we identify our own bias. As individuals, we can make changes that will be evident in our behavior and ultimately become skills that we can add to our cultural competence toolkit. For purpose of understanding a little more about your educational community, I've taken the time just to pull out some basic numbers. Let's take a look at students by ethnicity. As we do that, we need to acknowledge that ethnicity does not necessarily define culture. So, there can be multiple cultures represented within each ethnicity. Many may overlap into other ethnic categories. My production assistant's going to press a button for me. Can you press that button?
Sure.
Thanks, Lincoln. Okay, so let's just talk about the basics. Students by ethnicity in your school district. The number of Asian students is 439, and that is 12% of the population. The number of Hispanic students is 164, and that's 5% of the population. The number of black students is 86, and that's 3% of the population. The number of white students, 2,691, and that's 76% of the population. The number of Hawaiian students is 3 students, and that's less than 1% of the population. And the number of 2 or more races, as the students identify, is 152, and that's 8%. Got that number wrong. That is 4% of the population. This is information that is coming directly from publicschoolsreview.com. So this is just basic information that helps you to get a better understanding of what the numbers look like in your school district. And my assistant's going to press another button for me so we can move on to the next topic.
Let's go.
Thanks, Lincoln. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my experience. At this point, we've all engaged with information provided on microaggressions and microvalidation and invalidation. My experience in this space has to do with the way people respond to me as a presenter and a facilitator. Often I begin my learning projects with other participants by asking them what they've observed about me. I do this to exercise, let's say, their investigative skills, if any, or evaluate how observant they are. Without fail, I really mean this, without fail, I always get a response regarding one of 3 things. Participants respond that I am articulate or well-spoken. They also respond that I seem well-educated, and sometimes they respond that I'm well-dressed. Most of the time, though, I estimate approximately 90% of the time, it's that they respond that I'm articulate or well-spoken. So this is usually based on only a minute or 2 of me speaking or being in that room. I could take it as a compliment, but sometimes it doesn't feel so comfortable. Let me tell you why. I don't think that the participants intend to offend, but it does bother me on a cultural level. It makes me feel like they expect me to not be able to speak well or be articulate because I'm a black man. Now, I know they didn't say that. I also realize that maybe I have a bit more unpacking to do regarding my own cultural sensitivity, but can you see how this might make a person feel? Well, I won't get too much into it, but thanks for letting me be transparent with you and give you a little bit of insight about how I feel about these kind of things. Next, we're moving on to strategies for growing cultural competence. One of my favorites is self-assessment. It's a valuable tool to have in our toolkit. Much of what we do in striving towards cultural competence is actually assessing ourselves. So, meaning we're taking a look at our bias, we're looking at our decisions, we're trying to change our decisions, we're trying to change our behaviors, and thus building skills that we can use for our cultural competence toolkits. So let me talk to you about a few of the questions that you can use for your own benefit for cultural competence assessments. Assistant, can you press that button for me again, please?
Sure.
Okay, so for self-assessment, just a few questions that you can use, and you'll have a copy of this presentation so you can look at these questions, and these are specifically directed towards the work that we're doing here together. If you look online, there are many tools and many opportunities for you to use other self-assessment questions, but let's see how these work for us. And my expectation is not that you're going to get back to me and answer all these questions for me. These are really for your own evaluation. So for example, How does your worldview create a framework for you to understand different cultural groups? As a CSO, what skills, knowledge, behaviors, and attitudes do you need to be culturally competent? Are you able to acknowledge your own cultural bias? Are you prepared to challenge your own bias as it relates to the students you serve? Do you understand the cultural issues that students face in the educational setting? As it relates to cultural competence, do you expect students to adapt to your way of communication? Do you require yourself to adapt to the student's way of communication? Do you perceive that students of all cultures feel comfortable, safe, that is, in your presence, in your capacity as a CSO? Are you comfortable with intervening when you observe a culturally inappropriate incident? My assistant, can you hit a button?
Sure. No problem.
I'm one slide ahead, so I apologize for that part, but let me get back to talking to you a little bit about self-assessment. As a part of my own self-assessment, I realize that I'm excited by the time that I spend expanding my authentic relationships with people of other cultures. This requires more than just study of culture online, specifically TED Talks for me. I've learned to take a step forward and lean in and embrace the culture, and by doing so, embracing the people of the culture. You can expand your authentic relationships with people of other cultures by doing the same thing. Changing gears a bit, our discussion is not about race, yet racism occupies a large portion of the cultural competency space. In his book titled How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi introduced me to an idea that you're either a racist or an anti-racist. That was a hard pill for me to swallow. But as I began to unpack some of my own bias and issues surrounding race, I realized that I agree with this statement. Simply stated, we're either a part of the problem or we're part of the solution. So there's no in between. This holds true for the way that we serve the students who are entrusted to our care. When we're transparent about our desires to overcome our own bias and the people around us can see that our behavior is based on our ever-evolving work towards cultural competence, it becomes evident that we choose to be a part of the solution. We have to be willing to speak up so other people can learn. Well, that's it until our next gathering. Until then, remember that this is not the end of the conversation because there is no closure, just reorganization. We'll be getting together soon to kind of talk through some of the scenarios that go along with the things that we mentioned in our self-assessment, and we'll also talk a bit more about microaggressions. And we're going to talk about at least one incident in our national news that had to do with a CSO or a person working in that capacity and how things worked out for that individual. So until tomorrow, I believe it will be, thank you and I appreciate you. I can tell you that me and my production assistant have been working very hard on this production, as this is our 9th take, and we have gone through trees falling on the house, and I think it's 4 power outages as we've been trying to produce. So I have to give him credit and thank you. Thanks a lot, Lincoln.
You're welcome.
All right, I'll talk with you all soon. Thanks.
Bye.